So I'm doing it with my phone in my office, and so I had a couple ideas. There's two things I still need to talk about in the in between. This next Sunday, we're going to be finishing up the Abraham section of the Genesis story, and so each week in this midweek time, I've been kind of filling in some of the other parts and talking a little bit about just things that some other stuff that we just don't have time for on Sunday. Well, we could probably create time, but we haven't had time. I could talk for an hour and a half on Sunday morning. So today, in this one, I'll probably drop another one potentially tonight. I'm gonna focus in on. I'm just gonna read to you the story that I didn't get to on Sunday, going with chapter 16 and 17, and then even almost up to 18. Chapter 18. I'm gonna read it to you. And then I'm going to give some commentary. I put some links to some questions, so this will be here in the future. You'll be able to look at some of the questions, just think through it. Now the questions are designed really for you to just help guide maybe some of the thought, help you kind of go a little bit deeper. Not so you're not just using my words, but you're maybe taking my words at a launch pad and using them to help facilitate and allow the Spirit of God to work through you, so that you can begin to be impacted and shaped and transformed, and ultimately, like this midweek, which is really end week, is about a transformation of the heart. And so we're going to be in Genesis 16, 17. I'm going to read those stories to you, and then we're going to end up in Deuteronomy for a brief second as well. Deuteronomy 10, I believe. And so just let me read the story as it unfolds. Remember, this last Sunday was the third week of the series, and I spent a lot of time just talking about faith and how Abram was starting to doubt, and he needed God to remind him of the promises that he had already made. And the idea from this last Sunday is we just spent more time talking about faith, not as much about Abraham and Sarai, but that when we live as followers of Jesus, we're living our life in light of the promise that Jesus has died, was raised again, and that we have put faith, trust into that. And so I spent a lot of time talking about how you need to use your mind, you need to think, and you also need to believe with conviction, and that should shape the way in which you live. So anyway, we didn't get into the story, and that's why we have to do these. I'm doing these midweek talks just because I want to make sure we get through Genesis. So here we go. I'm just going to read to you, starting with chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, was born him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar, and Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. So just to pause for a second. Now Sarai is coming up with a plan because she just doesn't believe that God's going to provide this child to her, and says, "Take my servant Hagar, and she can be your wife so that we can have a kid." So again, living with faith and failure at the same time. And when he went into Hagar, verse 4 of chapter 16, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So Sarai, again, I don't need to give too much commentary here, but Sarai makes a plan and then treats Hagar poorly because of the plan succeeding. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong be done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." So there's this tension forming that's just kind of like, this is what happens when we make mistakes, when we fail, when we try to take matters into our own hand. We disrupt relationships. We disrupt. We destroy the fabric of what God's trying to build in us. But Abram said to Sarah, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, and the spring on the way of Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where you have come from and where you are going. Where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. So that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael. Because the Lord has listened to your affliction, he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So Hagar is getting a similar promise that Abram and Sarai got, that the descendants of Ishmael will be huge. There'll be a multitude. It'll be many, many, many. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing, for she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer-al-Roi. I'm horrible at pronouncing names. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called to the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So we see the beginning of and kind of the culmination of the plot of Sarai's mistrust that God was going to provide a child. And so she went into the scheme, and the scheme derailed. But ultimately what ended up happening is Hagar had a son, Ishmael. And Ishmael was thought of as a son from Abram. But still, we're going to take another step forward. Chapter 17, I'm going to read this next part where God introduced circumcision as part of the covenant. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and I may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram. So here we've been up to Abram, and I've been messing it up all the time just because I'm habitually say Abraham. But at this point in the story, in Abram's story, God's going to change his name. But your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. And if you're watching this with your kid, now's the time to teach him. Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just... Anyway, you know that song. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout the generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep, between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in the house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Now we're going to get into circumcision here in a second. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but there's one huge concept I think we just need to grab a hold of. There's a lot of digging around and things that we could do and talk, and there's so much New Testament talk of circumcision and just how God has used that. And let's be honest, it's kind of an awkward thing to talk about. But I'm going to spend a few minutes here in a second, but I want to finish up this story, chapter 17. And this is where God again promises a son, and this time verse 15 is he goes into more detail with Abraham. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her Sarai anymore, but Sarah, shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for your offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac from Sarah, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all those born in his house out or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcising the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcising the flesh of his foreskin. That very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. Okay. Well, that's a lot of words, a lot of things. But what it does is it catches the story up, and here's what we have. We have a reestablishment of the promise. We have the changing of the names of Abraham and Sarah from Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, and a reestablishment of the covenant with actually another layer with circumcision. Now, let's get into circumcision for just a second. It is super simple. God is asking that there's a physical evidence of an inward transformation. That's what circumcision is. It's a visible, physical covenant display of your inward obedience, of your inward heart, of the transformation of who you are. Now, it doesn't give a lot of detail. It doesn't say and walk through the steps as Abraham walked through his people and all that, and his son Ishmael. It doesn't give the details of how he talked with him and talked about how God provided. But what we get is that this behavior, this act, is a sign of what God is doing on the inside. Let's flip over to Deuteronomy real quick. We're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 10, and we're going to pick up in verse 12. And this is, I think, what happens when the circumcision covenant is put into place and then is played out, and now we're given some other words to it by Moses, and he talks about it in a deeper, more spiritual way, in a way that we understand it may be deeper other than just circumcision as the medical act or as the physical act. But here's what Moses is saying in Deuteronomy chapter 10. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. Verse 14, behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples as you are this day. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great and mighty, the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve him and hold fast to him, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise. He is your God, who has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in heaven. Moses is saying to the people, even after the Exodus, you need to circumcise your heart. Now, I've done probably, 25, maybe not that many, I don't know the number, a bunch of baptisms. And one of the things that I do when I do baptism is I ask the person I'm baptizing if they're going to follow the Lord all of the days of their life, if they're going to walk in the ways of the Lord, if they're going to make the Lord's ways their ways. That's one of the questions I ask, and they respond usually with the baptism of yes. Well, here in this passage where Moses is saying it's time to circumcise your heart, he says, Lord, again, I'm going to read it again. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord. Now, it is easy, I think, for us in this particular point in our world to just go, these are the things that you're supposed to do. And obedience sometimes can be faked. Obedience can be this thing that you kind of work your way through. I know when I was a teenager, it was easy for me to pretend like I was doing right, even though maybe my inward heart was like, I'm just going to get this done so I can move on to the next thing. I think that even goes as we become adults, where we just kind of go through the motions sometimes to get the thing done that we need to get done, and we obey, even though in our heart we're like resistant, or we're frustrated, or we're annoyed, or whatever sort of negative we want to use. And what circumcision is that sure, it's this physical act. It's this thing that happens to you, but it's supposed to signify a transformation of the inside. It's supposed to a shaping and a transforming of the heart. Just like when we do baptism, the baptism is an outward expression of what God has already done to the heart, to where God has already shaped and taken over and won the heart, so that you not just obey out of like duty or responsibility or fear, but you obey because you love. You obey because you trust. You obey because you want to. And in the covenant of circumcision, this exterior snipping, so to speak, is supposed to represent that God is shaping and snipping the heart to be conformed or chiseled into how he wants it to be. Again, not so we can let me stop for a second. Not so just for the individual, but also to show the nations who God is. Sure, there is a relational component, and that's a primary part of our faith and our walk with the Lord, is that we have this relationship with God. But the point of it is to show who God is. That he loves mercy, that he carries out justice, that he loves the sojourner, that he loves the pilgrim, that he provides for those who are weak. He puts people in power and position so that they can help. And if a person has a heart that is shaped and transformed by God, then he's able to carry out mercy, justice, and righteousness and show the people around him who God is. So this physical act, this outward demonstration of circumcision, is a reflection of what's going on in the soul. I remember that when I was baptized, and there was just a significant kind of moment. There was a distance between when I accepted the Lord and when I was baptized, and we've done that in our own household too, because we want to make sure that the heart, and there's no legalism there or some sort of like timeline. We just want to make sure the heart is being shaped and that God is really grabbing a hold. And I remember having that same experience that as I was getting older and God was working on me, and I was struggling with some of my failures and struggling with some of my doubts, like Abraham was struggling with making good decisions and poor decisions. My heart was getting shaped and shaped and shaped and shaped, so that the moment when I was baptized, it was like this solidification of things that God had already been doing. And we see that in Abraham's story, that he called him out in Genesis 12 and asked him to leave his land, and we see the ups and downs of his life and the doubting that God's going to provide for this promise and all of these just the different ups and downs, to where we come to this final point before the big reveal, before the big payoff, before the big promise of Isaac actually comes to fruition, and God says it's time to physically have this altercation to your body to signify the relationship we have, the covenant we have with one another, and in circumcision. Now, we could get into a lot of New Testament stuff where Paul talks about it. I don't think we need to right now, but I want to press in again and say, what's God doing in shaping your heart? How is it happening? Are you surrendering? Are you submitting? I think about a 13-year-old boy, Ishmael, that's what Scripture teaches us, having to submit to his father who's going to circumcise him. Think about that. Not probably a fun experience. Not probably an ideal morning for him. And so there's this attitude that we need to have when we're being shaped and grown by the Lord, as we're wrestling through our struggles, or we're having moments of success in faith, to where God is working us, and we need to submit to that. And so circumcision is a weird thing to talk about, and we needed to touch base on it. I needed to have the midweek talk to where we kind of filled in the gaps of these two stories of Sodom and Gomorrah and what happened with the promise, and how these two are smushed together with the promise of Isaac, the birth of Ishmael, and Sarah's plot to actually, because she doubted what God was doing, and how God came in and again rescued all this. Now, one last little piece here I think is hilarious. There's two different situations. We didn't read the rest of it. We read it a couple weeks ago on a Sunday morning. But Abraham laughed at God, and Sarah also laughed at God that he was going to provide. And that's one of those questions that I think is good for us to wrestle with. Have you ever laughed when you felt like God was calling you to do something and like, that's ridiculous? No way. And even the matriarch of the Jewish faith, of our faith, it laughed at God. Said, there's no way that's possible. I'm an old man. I'm 90 years old. There's no way this is going to happen. So I just think that's interesting. It's a insight that shows that in spite of all the good things Abraham did, there was still that kind of that doubt that creeped and turned inside of him. It made him human. Made him feel very relatable. And so this is Genesis 16 and 17. I know I read a lot and talked a lot. I hope you continue to grow at home, dig into the Word at home, wrestle with these questions, even with your kids, or figuring out what's God have for you. How am I supposed to be growing daily by these Old Testament stories as we continue to march through it. This next Sunday, we're going to have the bookend of Abraham and Isaac, with the famous story from Abraham where Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac. We're going to talk about that on Sunday morning. There's going to be one more midweek talk with Abraham and Abimelech. We'll probably get into that next week, and then we're going to move on to Jacob. So we have Jacob and Joseph we're going to deal with. We have 9 more weeks of Genesis, and we're going to get all the way to the end. It's been fun, and we're going to continue to dive in deep. Thanks for listening today. Have a great weekend.